This training is regarding students with disabilities. I'm blind, not deaf. The servers always speak so loudly when I place my order. People are very quick to think that just because my eyes look weird, that I can't hear. He doesn't belong in my classroom, let alone in a public school. They need to supervise their kids. Special education teachers are called special for a reason. You know what I mean? These statements are stigmatizing and hurtful. Consider these statements as you progress through this training. Are the comments kind? Are they helpful? Our why. Tullahoma City Schools exist to provide challenging and innovative experiences that support each student's academic, social, and emotional development, preparing them to live with integrity and a sustained passion for learning. Notice that the statement says each student, not some students or the rich students or the normal students. Do the comments on the previous slide align with this statement? As far back as the 1800s, people with disabilities were set apart or marginalized for their appearance or their learning difficulties. In the 1920s, World War I veterans with disabilities increased their expectations of the government. The 1930s brought improvements in technology and government assistance. Self-reliance and self-sufficiency of individuals with disabilities improved as a result of these developments. In the 40s and 50s, World War II veterans increased pressure on the government as well to obtain financial assistance and other assistance for them for their rehabilitation after their injuries sustained in battle. The 1960s brought on the civil rights movement, which also helped individuals with disabilities. In 1973, the first disability legislation passed. The Rehabilitation Act passed, providing equal opportunity for individuals in federally funded programs. More progression occurred 2 years later with the Education Act for all handicapped children. This law was renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, in 1990. This is also the time when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. We will discuss some of these laws in more detail in a few minutes. The laws that were just shared drive everything when it comes to students with special needs. Our federal and state departments of education typically communicate these laws and policies so that we can reach the needs of all students here within Tullahoma City Schools. A person's disability is not necessarily something you can see. Every disability and person with a disability is different. We have 16 educational disability categories here in Tennessee. You can see that the disabilities with the highest incidence are specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, and other health impairment. Remember what we learned about most disabilities not being visible. This is why. In Tennessee, we can see that our students with the most severe disabilities are the least engaged population after high school. We will revisit this on a later slide. In our district, we have approximately 20% of our entire student population with a disability. This number includes students with individualized education plans, or IEPs, and students with Section 504 plans. You can see the breakdown of those two categories here. So let's revisit those educational laws. If a student qualifies for one of our 16 disability categories mentioned earlier, then they need an IEP. The components of the IEP will be reviewed later. The Americans with Disabilities Act, as shared earlier, passed in 1990. It ensured equal access and equal treatment of individuals with disabilities to employment opportunities and public restrooms. This was an anti-discrimination law, but struggles still exist for people with disabilities. This law is the reason we have wheelchair accessible ramps and restrooms, for one example. To revisit the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, this was the first time individuals with disabilities were protected by law. It prohibited discrimination on the basis of either physical or mental disability in federally funded programs. This law is the reason we have Section 504 plans. A student with a Section 504 plan typically only requires accommodations for classroom assignments or tests, or both. These are the beliefs of the Tennessee Department of Education. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, ensures free and appropriate public education, basically and mostly within the least restrictive environment, along a continuum of services, with use of inclusive practices. The Tennessee Department of Education has provided a framework for special educators to make decisions based upon these principles. What is the LRE? The LRE is the regular classroom. The LRE follows the least dangerous assumption. The least dangerous assumption states that in the absence of absolute evidence, it is essential to make the assumption that if proven to be false, would be least dangerous to the individual. Therefore, IEP teams should operate from the criterion of least dangerous assumption by considering the least restrictive setting, which is general education first for all students, regardless of disability, before considering more restrictive settings. Evidence and data collected should be discussed before making the determination that a student requires a more restrictive setting at each IEP meeting. No benefit, marginal benefit, or disruptive force must be proven. This graphic demonstrates the continuum of services, ranging from the general education setting to the most restrictive placement, which would be a student's home or hospital placement. This particular graphic has combined the special education curriculum with the response to intervention model. Notice that some students could participate in both special education and RTI. According to the Speech Language Hearing Association, 80% of students with a specific learning disability also have a language impairment. This could explain much of the overlap of services. This is also important for staff to consider collaboration between special educators and general educators to help close gaps when core instruction is occurring. This graphic also draws attention to the question of what state-mandated standards a student may be missing when pulled from the general education setting for intervention. The heart of an IEP, or an individualized education plan or program, is core instruction and transition. Remember what we learned earlier, that our students with the most severe needs have the poorest post-school outcomes. Is this directly linked to these students missing the most core instruction? This is interesting to think about, isn't it? This slide shows a bare bones progression of disability identification and the IEP team minimum members. Identification begins with a thorough assessment, which typically results in eligibility or a lack of eligibility. If a student is eligible, an IEP is developed. If a student is not eligible, the student may not be eligible for any type of service. In some situations, a student is eligible for a Section 504 plan. You can see the IEP team minimum members listed here. Again, the heart of the IEP is core instruction and transition. We've seen how these two themes must be at the focus of every student's plan. But also important to note, every part of the IEP influences another. A strong evaluation leads to strong narratives, present levels, and goals. These components contribute to the decision about accommodations and modifications. Accommodations and modifications are basically tools to assist a student in being successful in the general education setting. An accommodation will change how the student accesses information, engages in learning, or demonstrates their knowledge. A modification will change what the student is taught or expected to learn. Changing what a student is taught or expected to learn limits their access to both core instruction and transition, the two most important pieces of a student's education. So, what are the expectations for employees when it comes to students with disabilities? Don't make negative assumptions about any student's abilities or disabilities. Remember, each student is different. Get to know our students who have disabilities and try to form a friendly relationship with them. Use person-first language. Talk about the student with autism, not the autistic kid. Help with behavior only when asked to do so, or in emergency situations. If you see something such as mistreatment of a student with a disability, say something. Ensure confidentiality as expected. We hope that you've benefited from this training about students with disabilities. Read the statements that were shared at the beginning of the presentation and reflect on the Tullahoma City Schools mission. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to the Office of Special Education. We're located at the Community School Services Building at this address,